too many exciting things happened over the past weekend. I thought we had to make a podcast episode to cover this. DeepSeek has been at the top of everyone's mind, even Donald Trump's mind, right? Which is very surprising. I think for the first time after Huawei has a Chinese company made the president's speech so quickly, so promptly when something happens. So I think as a Chinese person, I feel quite excited
Mhm.
about all the development here. So yeah, to get in, Julia, why are you excited about DeepSeek?
I think they made some very profound technical discoveries that is giving us a lot of hope when it comes to the future of AI. So, for a while now, we know that we've hit a wall with the internet where we've consumed the entirety of it and there's no more public data. So, other than finding, digitizing new data or getting access to private data, there isn't much chance of improving things in that direction. But with DeepSeek, we see that there's a really promising way of continuing to scale up through compute as opposed to
Mm,
data. We already knew this because O1 has started evangelizing the idea of reinforcement learning and chain of thought, which are very compute intensive but not as data intensive. However, with DeepSeek, we see that it's actually feasible with less than tens of billions of dollars. So
yeah.
it's a deeply optimistic result for technology in general.
Yeah, it reminds me of Sam's comment about there isn't a war. Maybe he wasn't talking about O1. Maybe he already got a preview of DeepSeek R1 to go, oh, yeah, it's cheap and good at the same time. Yeah, to me, the most exciting thing is the capability, the price to performance ratio of these new models are just crazy. Because if it wasn't open source, I'd say this is Chinese companies trying to compete, trying to underprice their opponents by taking a loss to take a market because they have the arsenal to be able to survive the loss in the short term. But looking at the model, and I'm sure I'd want to ask you is how they're able to get this so cheap later. But the fact that they are able to is quite crazy. It enables so many more applications which wasn't feasible because even let's say has half of O1's capability. O1 costs $15 per million input token and $60 per million output. R1 is like 30 cents. Or was it 50 cents per million input token and then $3 per million output? The price is just insane. I think being able to have such level of intelligence, we shouldn't really care about, okay, did it really beat O1? I think it doesn't have to. It got close. That's all that matters. The fact that it got that close with a 20th of the price, I think that's what we should be focusing our attention on. And
And
that's really what got me really excited.
and this
Yeah.
price calculation, are you referring to the biggest 600 billion parameter model? Or is this calculation based on one of the distilled models? Because they distilled models into Llama and Quen.
Oh yeah, this is the original model, the 600 billion parameter model, the price that they are currently charged. And from what I've learned from most Chinese media interviews and looking at their, at least all of their public statements, they always say they make a profit on their current token pricing, whether it was for V3, V2, or R1. And because they're also a quantitative trading firm, I think they're probably not lying there because
Hmm.
there's no incentive for them to really in most places.
Impressive then.
Yeah, and I think because DeepSeek V3 should be half the price or roughly half the price of R1, I can only expect the distilled models. I haven't checked the pricing for any of the distilled models to be a lot cheaper there. What else are you also excited for?
I'm excited because when O1 came out, there was so little information that we knew about how it works internally. So we already had the glimmer of hope that there's other ways to scale, but we had absolutely no visibility into it. And even though DeepSeek hasn't open sourced the training data set, they still open source the model and also they published a pretty detailed technical report. So I
Mm,
feel like it's just intellectual candy that they threw our way. And it's really, really exciting.
intellectual candy. I really like that.
It's really exciting to read the paper, and it just feels like a good book, a book that captivates you. That's what I feel like in research terms.
It finally feels like there's more players in this field because in the past year, it just felt it was mostly okay. There's Anthropic, there was OpenAI, and then there was Llama, and Llama only became more relevant middle of the year, and then suddenly someone else actually came through, came much closer to the frontier models, and especially at the pricing point, and more importantly, coming from China. I think this is probably what most people did not expect. That makes me quite excited. At the end of the day, I think democratizing AI, you really have to have all nations trying to compete at the same time. So this is not about, hey, US, China, which one wins? I think that to me matters a lot less. But just the fact that, oh, people and teams from different countries of origin going different paths can get close to similar results. And then that makes me even more excited about well, AGI at the end of the day, when Sam was saying, yeah, things are accelerating, it's going to be here soon, I feel like, okay, maybe he's just chanting for the shareholders to invest more. But now seeing DeepSeek, it's like, okay, maybe we are accelerating. Things are moving a lot faster than what most people are expecting. So,
Mm.
yeah, that's part I'm super excited for.
It reminds me of the space race. I'm sure that Russia put a lot of pressure on the US, and overall, both countries had to win and
Yeah.
had to take something from that competition.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, this war maybe it is quite similar to the Cold War, right? Trying to get the first person onto the moon and then seeing which nation will get to AGI first. It'll be exciting. I
Or who
think
picks
the
it most
race has
safely.
just got more interesting.
It's harder
So
to
yeah,
fake though, because you could fake the moon landing, maybe, but, when you open source models, it's harder to fake things.
that's true. I mean, makes us even more excited, right? And makes it more interesting for people to replicate. I already know a lot of teams and just well, I mean, even whether it's open source teams or I'm sure big tech companies are doing very similar things, trying to replicate what DeepSeek is already doing in R1 and in their own, whether internal or open source models. I think we should see some more quite exciting things coming up, and also Anthropic as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if they release a reasoning model within the next 60 days, if not 30.
Yeah, I bet Meta is scrambling internally. But interestingly, I also saw Hugging Face made like a public call to contributors because they want to reproduce the entire pipeline, including the training data set. And I thought that was interesting.
Didn't they pop? I think I saw a tweet maybe this morning where they mentioned they produced at least some of the benchmark results, or at least got very close. I think it was the
Hmm.
math benchmarks and some other ones with the existing data. So the fact that with this is a week, right? Fuck, it's just been a week. Oh man.
It's 9 days
People
more precisely.
and it's just been a week and people been reproducing the results and getting some similar benchmark numbers. I think this is just crazy. Also, the beauty of open source, right?
Which reminds me, why did we only started seeing things on Twitter this weekend? Because the model was published on January 20th, if I'm not wrong, and my Twitter started blowing up only on the weekend. So what's up with that gap?
My take is the at the time when the model was released, it only existed in web chat. But over the weekend, they released their no, it was just before the weekend they released their iOS app and also included web search alongside of that reasoning model, which is something that no one else has done. Even O1, I never got why chat OpenAI never allowed O1 to do the web search because it feels like they have access to the same embeddings. Maybe it requires further fine tuning, or maybe it's too resource intensive. Don't know why. But having a reasoning model also tied together to web search, that feels powerful. And also in general, when you see that thinking tag going on for a long time and you feel like you've asked the right question, I always feel proud when I see O1 say, O1 thought for 51 seconds before giving you the answer. I said, yeah, I asked a hard question. Similarly, I think for DeepSeek, when you have access to real time information plus that reasoning capability, I can see why that gets people excited, even for consumers.
How often do you use
Yeah.
O1 as opposed to 4.0 or 4.0 mini, whatever your default is?
I never exceeded the rate limit for O1, and that is 50 queries per week. And then for the $20 tier, I only ask strategic questions at O1 because most times you don't want to wait that long for that thinking time to get things correct. You're just doing searches, maybe you're just asking a coding question, and 4 is or Claude is already more than capable for doing that. But if I
Yeah.
have something that requires, okay, I'm thinking about this business strategy, here's the outline, help me think of the points I've missed or help me further strategize the content. This is the type of more thinking or logical related questions I like to ask O1, but otherwise, it just doesn't feel that effective. Um, but DeepSeek, their thinking model, I try to use that more because you can see that thinking trace. And then reading the full thinking trace is also a great way to learn the logic of, okay, maybe this is a way I should also think. Ah, that's a point I
Mhm.
never missed. And this is a way of thinking about the problem that I never thought of. So that also find quite intriguing to just improve my own thinking capabilities. Yeah. What
Hmm.
about you?
I rarely use O1, and that's because at this point in time, ChatGPT for me has almost entirely replaced Google. And most of my queries are super fast and super dumb. So I do not need a lot of intelligence. I just need a little bit of access to the internet and a little bit more intelligence than Google. So because of that, I don't use O1 very often.
Mm. I think that brings on an interesting point, right? For most consumers and most everyday use case, speed and experience matters a lot more than that 100% correctness if you're already the expert in the area,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Yeah. I think that's quite exciting. I've been reading a lot on Twitter about just how people are sharing the history of the team, but I feel there's still a lot of information that people never really talked about. Um, People generally think that, oh, DeepSeek just became a thing overnight. And oh, well, why was it this team that was doing it? But in reality, I don't feel like this is a coincidence. Having done a bit of research back into the team, is the CEO and founder, so Liang Wenfeng, he's been in the ML trading space since 2008. Ever since he graduated, he's been trying to use ML in trading. Then he had didn't do so well before 2015. So that was 7 years of a lot of trial and error. And then in 2015, he created his own hedge fund called High Flyers in English. I think it has a much better Chinese name called 换方量化, but I don't have a good translation for it. Maybe I'll post one in the comments below later. But it's they were doing really well and became one of the big four quantitative trading firms very quickly in China. And at that peak, they managed over 10 billion in US dollars in terms of assets back in this was 2021, I believe. So they had already a lot of top talent in terms of quant traders as well as a lot of ML talent. They were accumulating GPUs as early as 2019. So some of this was even before the sanctions actually came through. And then people were like, "Oh yeah, how did Dixie get access to all of this stuff?" They had a lot of this for what they were originally going to build for trading. And I thought, "Oh man, this was the pivot designed by God for them to be having to be able to privately fund all of these data centers to be able to have the talent to go straight into this without any external source of funding. I think that's also what makes DeepSeek quite exciting because without external interference and without external constraint from investors, and with its capability and a lot of now, I think Chinese, maybe the whole confidence of whole of China behind DeepSeek's team. So I'm sure they can do quite a lot, and that's quite different to a lot of pure private companies that's gone through fundraisers. But yeah, and looking at the CEO, they got into the LLM space back in 20 to mid 2023 and then quickly released DeepSeek V2 in a few months time and then 2.53 followed at the tail end of last year, which all did really well. But I think one thing was consistent was the efficiency. The efficiency has just been ultra high throughout the history of their model development. They never released the expensive model, right? And unlike a few other Chinese companies, also the reason they were also able to do this out of many companies in China, they are only the one out of the big four, which is the big four tech companies in China. For people who don't know, that's ByteDance, there's Alibaba, there's Tencent, there's also Baidu, which is not as well heard of recently. They were the the Chinese Google for quite a while, and they were quite
And
big.
ByteDance is the TikTok owner, is that right?
Sorry,
Who of these 4 companies owns TikTok?
ByteDance.
ByteDance, right? Mhm.
Yeah. So those were the only four companies that had more than 10,000 GPUs in China, and then DeepSeek was the only other.
Mm.
And so they were already really well positioned to do this. Yeah, so with all of the infrastructure, talent, and everything set up, it seemed like the perfect pivot. So, it, looking back at history, none of this feels like a coincidence. It's just the stars were lining up for them to do this thing, and they had the right perseverance, talent, money, resources, and infrastructure to go straight into this. So yeah, and I thought that was actually like quite exciting. Is I think people shouldn't just think, oh yeah, DeepSeek got lucky and they did this thing. No, the guy has been in this space for almost 20 years now, so he knows his shit. But talking about efficiency, I know Julia, you read through the 50, was it 50 pager? V3 and R1 paper back to back, right?
There's
Tell
DeepSeek
me more,
math
like
as well.
how are they able to do this thing at such high efficiency? I'm still mind boggled by the 30 cents and 50 cents cost. Tell us more.
Well, obviously there's many, many, many layers of depth. Um, I would say that the biggest innovations come from 2 directions. One of them is this idea of scaling via compute, and the other one are just very smart implementation efficiencies. So when we talk about scaling via compute, um, that's as opposed to data. Because we've been training on the entirety of the internet, we hit this wall where there's just no more data to consume. Um, so scaling via compute is just another dimension of growth where we just give the model more floating point operations as a way of going bigger. And the second innovation is a bunch of very, very efficient implementation details. For instance, one of them is how they implemented reinforcement learning. They managed to reduce the number of parameters required by half. So reinforcement learning is pretty inefficient when it comes to compute during training. And it actually requires training not just your main model, your main LLM, but training other models as well. One of them is called the value model. Not super important, but the point is they managed to approximate that model. So all of a sudden they had half the parameters that a model usually has, which is huge because if you're training a model that has 600 billion parameters, you would rather not have to train double that.
Oh, I didn't
So
realize
that,
you had to use so much compute even in the values model. That's super interesting.
yeah. And then there's other things like DeepSeek R1 is actually a mixture of experts model. And that's why it's so huge and it has 600 billion parameters.
I got to ask a really dumb question. I've heard
What's a mixture?
mixture of expert so much, and I see that mentioned so many times in the paper. What is it?
Yeah. It's a particular type of architecture that is quote unquote sparse. What that means is throughout the model, there's multiple paths, and each input or user instruction will fire a specific path. So when you do inference, you don't actually use all of the 600 billion parameters. You will use some path through the model. And you can think of each of these paths as an expert. That's why it's a mixture of experts.
Ah, right. So can I think of this? So the most models that we see now is a extremely powerful generalist model, which requires most of the network to function to be able to give you the full results.
Actually, the entirety of the network. So if you think of Llama or Quen.
Mm,
All of these are dense models. That means every single weight is going to be used when doing inference. But when it
mm.
comes to DeepSeek R1, certain paths are just absolutely not going to be used. So you're not using 600 billion parameters during inference, but they exist and you need to store them and you need to train them.
Oh, right. But does that mean it also makes inference a lot more efficient as well because it only needs to activate a part of the network?
Yeah, it's more efficient than having to activate the entire network, but 6 billion parameters is still quite a lot. So that's why they take this mixture of experts model and they distill it into the smaller ones from ranging from 1 to 70 billion or whatever the range is for llama. So that's another efficiency gain there, that with such a powerful model, they
Mm.
manage to train students that are meaningfully, like by 100x, by 10x smaller, yet perform comparably to the bigger model.
When you say, um, training the student, you mentioned a distillation. Can you just give the audience a bit more context on what distillation is?
Yeah, it's super simple. You take a super big model that performs very well, you generate training data with that model, and then you train your smaller model on that data. So
Okay.
there's some sort of information transfer that happens from the big model to the small model. And the metaphor here is that the bigger model is the teacher because it kind of transfers knowledge to the student.
Okay. And the intuitive question I always have then here is that given the same training data set, why can't you just train the smaller model on the exact same data set? And I've heard it performs worse in most cases. Why is that?
So I think your question is, why do I have to produce the training data with the big model? Why can't I just use real data to
Yeah, to
train the
train the
student?
small model directly.
Yeah, the way I like to explain this is to think about the very first application of distillation, which was introduced in the context of MNIST. Have you heard of that data set?
No, I haven't.
It's basically images of digits, handwritten digits, and their corresponding label. So you would get digits from 0 to 9, and the
Yeah.
task is to just recognize those digits. And for the first time for that data set, they showed that distilling the student is actually better than just training the student on raw data. And the reason is the teacher actually produces knowledge or uncovers knowledge that is not explicitly in the data set. For instance, a 1 and a 7 kind of look like together. Sorry, kind of look similar, right?
Mm.
But when you look at the data set, there's nothing explicitly telling you, hey, in general, ones and sevens are easy to um, get wrong. But when the teacher tells the student, or when the teacher produces the training data for the student, instead of saying, hey, this is a 7, it says, hey, there's a 90% probability this is a 7, and there's a 30% probability this is a 1. Whereas the real data set would just say, hey, this is a 7. So because of that smoothness of the probability distribution, now the student gets to learn from the teacher some information that the teacher has uncovered about the world, which is that ones and sevens are kind of similar. And because it gets that information very explicitly shoved into it, it doesn't have to do the work to discover that. So it's really like a good teacher that kind of spells things out for you. Now,
Mm.
when it comes to distillation for LLMs, the exact same principle maybe doesn't apply because we literally just show the text to the student model. We don't necessarily show the distribution. But the argument there is that it's not visible to us humans how the text generated by a model is just easier to kind of quote unquote model or represent in mathematical functions than the text that we would produce. So it's subtly kind of easier to learn.
Right, right. In a lot of ways, it feels like we can let the teacher figure out what is the best way to teach the students rather than,
Mm,
hey, here's the world. Go figure it out yourself by falling on your face.
exactly. Yeah. Very good metaphor.
Yeah. Okay, very exciting. So mixture of experts, the
Hallucination.
distillation. What else?
A lot of hardware optimizations, and these were present actually in DeepSeek V3. They
Oh
don't
wait,
really
hardware
mention them in.
optimizations. I didn't
Yeah,
realize. Yeah.
there's attention, for instance, which is part of the transformer architecture. It's a building block in the transformer architecture. Is quite expensive, and yeah, they just come up with very creative ways of caching things and multiplying things in a much more efficient way that takes advantage of the properties of the hardware. And then one final one is they figured out how to do training in floating point 8 as opposed to 16, which is what models use in the US.
Oh, that's another 2x efficiency gain, right? Just for free
Mhm.
across the board, even if
Mm,
we ignore MOE and the rest of the stuff.
exactly. All,
Okay.
all of these are kind of orthogonal and they just like pile on top of each other.
Okay, right. So in based on what you said, we are likely already seeing a 5 to 10x model efficiency increase, even given it's a 600 billion parameter model, right? Given what you just said, using a floating point and MOE, or I mean, distillation gets you even a step further on top of that on cheaper
Yeah.
models. I know Julie has already made a great video, and which I've linked in the description and also up there. Go check it out if you want to go dive deeper into this. Now that we understand why DeepSeek is so cheap and so efficient and how they've actually trained the thing, I think it would be interesting to discuss. Now, being a Chinese founder who's currently based in Europe, I know you're a European founder currently based in the US. So we've got the full spectrum of views. How do you think this makes the competition and the relationship between the two countries more interesting?
I think competition is good. And one of the things I love about being a European in the US is just seeing capitalism in full bloom. And I don't think that capitalism can exist without competition. So I think this is very welcome. Of course, you want to win as much as possible. But if I have to lose once in a while for the sake of capitalism, then I'll do so.
Mm. It's a capital. It's the world's capitalism in this case, right? Not just the UK's.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's
And
worldwide capitalism.
yeah, for me, this is quite exciting where I don't think anyone expected China to be able to produce this level of model, especially given the sanctions. And when I read into the further I look into this, the further it makes me think that the sanctions may have forced China to be this efficient in a lot of ways. I mean, not that China didn't want to. I'm sure if we look at the way China has always operated, whether it's becoming the world's factory or leading in a lot of renewable energy tech, say solar panels, EVs, and others, and even high speed rail, they were really great at scaling things up really quickly and efficiently. So, in a lot of ways, I feel like this is at the heart of how China excels in the current world. So this would have been path I think people would have chosen anyway. But given the sanctions, this may have been the only path that was possible for people to go
Yeah.
down. So I see also a lot of people. I remember we were discussing. You mentioned to me, are blaming Biden for applying the chip sanctions because it forced China to do a better model. Well, I think that's maybe on the extreme side. I'm sure China, at least having confidence in China as I do, would have come up with a good model, maybe in a very different way without doing this, but very interesting to see the competition. And like, how do you feel like being in the US? What is the sentiment like? How do you feel people feel about, oh, it's a Chinese company that's doing this? I don't think
Mhm.
maybe if it's other European companies, I don't feel like it would have made as big stir, or even if it was, the Llama 3.2 or Llama 4 came out. Yeah.
Well, I think we all live lives on two separate levels. One of them is the day to day, and the other one is more on an ideals kind of philosophical level. So if I think about my day to day, I'm actually, I only stand to gain from China making progress. As I said before, I'm getting the intellectual candy about reading super interesting research. I become hopeful that my profession being a technologist still has a future. On a more philosophical, kind of ethical level, there's definitely a little bit of a fearful vibe. So, for
Mm,
instance, I was reading the what are they called? The terms of service, or is there a better word for it? Where basically they described what they do with your data. And I saw that they track your keystrokes. Let me find the exact terminology because I don't want to be making stuff up. 1 second. They say we collect keystroke patterns or rhythms. I actually tweeted about that because neither OpenAI nor Anthropic are collecting that kind of information. And it sounds to me like that would really allow you to identify
hmm.
people to the, very individual level. That felt very unnecessary. But I also wonder how much of this is legalese. Maybe they just got a really good lawyer who's like covering all of their bases. You never know, but that gives me a little bit of pause. So if I say something against Xi Jinping and then I go on a
Deleted it.
trip to China, and then I just happen to swipe on a Chinese phone, are they going to know it's me? I don't know. That's not a problem I face on a day to day basis. So I don't know if I care about it too much.
Mm. Oh, what I find interesting there is that obviously these terms of service is public for anyone to read, but none of this stopped consumers from downloading and using the app at the end. And it reminds me of the case of how TikTok got popular 6 7 years ago, and how Timu, the ultra cheap shipping and like Chinese produce company that's doing really well, and also is still one of the top six in the US, and now DeepSeek going on top. So if it wasn't TikTok being banned, so top six would have had three Chinese apps in the US App Store, which feels like, wait, isn't this completely opposite of what the US Gov is actually trying to do? But in a way,
Mhm.
it made me also realize more that consumers just care about experience. They care about cost. When you
Mhm.
commoditize something so much and make the experience decent, privacy is way less of a concern. It's a national security concern for the government, but it's not really a concern for most individuals. I think it's for us techies. We have a lot of concern around, okay, I'm actually going to read terms of service. How are they going to use my data? I care about it. Oh, I want to run my model locally deployed so I don't expose anything. But for most people, it's like, oh, it's cheap, it's free, it's good. Why not? Because
Yeah,
what I find funny is that unlike most other Chinese companies, DeepSeek did not try to hide their Chinese origin. Because even
mhm.
in the developer section, most of the time you'll see the app name and developer name right underneath. They didn't even bother translating that into an English name in their Apple developer registration, and then just straight up Chinese characters. Even that didn't stop US consumers from downloading the thing. And then that actually, in a way, got me quite excited, where I think there's no borders for good consumer apps. When there's good tech and good product, it will just have that widespread adoption because it's just so good. And in a way, it feels like the Chat GPT moment from 2 or so years ago, where it was released, it was free, and then everyone swarmed into using it. And very
Mhm.
similarly, I think similarly for DeepSeek. And given the amount of usage, I think they are also implicitly building up a data moat that they did not expect.
I'm going to say, though, I'm not looking forward to a future where China feels so confident about its dominance in the AI world and in the AI research world that they're just going to publish their papers in Chinese and be like, good luck. I know you're going to try to translate it. So why would I bother? Yeah, selfishly, because I
But
don't know Chinese, I'm not looking forward to that.
but I say if the models are so good and the Chinese are so confident, the model should be good enough at translating that very accurately, word for word, meaning to meaning, into English without any issue, including images, right?
Good point. Okay, so maybe the future is not that dark after all.
Yeah, and
Um,
like you said before, it's very exciting to have these things so spread out and so democratized when everyone is able to just read into this. I think this is something that I still don't quite get from DeepSeek, which is why they did everything open source. Because it's such advanced models. It's not like they were 6 months to a year behind most frontier models. Why would they do this? Like, what's your take on that?
Not that I know for sure, but I've heard that drug dealers give you the first dose for free to get you hooked.
Well, I mean,
So,
ChatGPT did this, right?
yeah, true, exactly. So I can imagine a future in which you're just you start trusting DeepSeek because they're open source, and then comes the commercial version, whatever it is. And now all of a sudden, there's some sort of psychological trust that they've built over time, and you're more likely to buy the commercial version, especially if it's so much cheaper than OpenAI. So ultimately, it's probably
Mm,
a trust exercise.
yeah. And in a way, I was also thinking about this the other day, where this may be a slight overgeneralization, but I do feel most people have very little trust on Chinese apps or Chinese tech, especially if it was closed source, right?
I still haven't installed TikTok on none of my phones ever.
It is
Sometimes
really good. It is so good for wasting your
that's a
time. And
problem.
it is just the ultimate version of doom scrolling. If you think Twitter is doom scrolling, it's not. TikTok is
I
true doom
prefer
scrolling. About my point of because people have so little trust on most Chinese apps, I feel like for most Chinese companies, and this is not just DeepSeek, right? Alibaba open source their QN and all the QN coders. There's the 70B and 11B models, all I think performing really good on benchmarks, right? I think they also made a stir when they were all released, but just not as big as current DeepSeek's one. The same for Tencent, the same for ByteDance in terms of a lot of open source models. I feel like this may have been the required step to really gain trust of the Western community of going, hey, we're not just going to tell you metrics and you think that, oh, we're boasting great tech when we don't have anything. It's open source. Run it for yourself, reproduce for yourself. You'll know for sure. I think that, in a way, has been a really smart play in terms of giving people that confidence. Like you said, doing DeepSeek, the app for free, is like giving people the first dose of the drug for free by the drug dealer. Maybe open source is exactly the same thing. It's giving the developer, the research community, the same first dose of that drug to maybe
yeah.
even attract talent on top of this, not just to gain trust, but also attract talent. When I was reading a interview with the DeepSeek CEO from I think just 6 months ago. They mentioned DeepSeek V2. All of the research team were purely Chinese and then hired from China. And even himself, he doesn't believe that they have any of the top 200 talent, but they believe they'll be able to train or have the best talents in the future. I think that's to me is also like quite exciting. And then now with the stuff they've made with the rest of the world, I also feel like attracting talent on top of building trust may have been their major purpose. Whether it's by coincidence or not, but it's super exciting.
Interesting. Yeah, marketing and recruitment for sure. You didn't tell me how you feel as a Chinese living in the Western world. How do you feel proud? What's going on in your head?
I Well, I mean, as I grew up in China, I definitely feel proud that a Chinese company is taking great stride in such frontier tech, because even in my mind, in most places, China wasn't known for the place for innovation. In most places, it's really good at producing things. It's really good at replicating things, but rarely do you hear people talk about China as, oh, hey, they are leading the frontier in something. This happened a few times in the past 2 decades. I feel EVs have been a thing. High speed rail have definitely been another. Production, I think to most people, it doesn't feel high tech enough to feel like it's leading like the Silicon Valley is doing. So this, for the first time, feels like China came out with something that is leading or maybe completely surprised. And most of Silicon Valley even this time. That to me has been quite exciting because in a lot of ways, um, this is again, I know I'm quoting the DeepSeek CEO quite a lot because he did say a lot of interesting, very interesting
Mhm.
guy. I'll link the original Chinese article, the interview article in the description so people can read into it through Translate, but a really worth a read because it's not that China is lacking top talent, it's that because China isn't doing enough innovative tech, the top talents aren't being discovered. And so most people are going into, oh, the traditional big tech, the big tech of China, and then going into those traditional industries. And because slight lack of research inside those innovative tech, so you don't see the same level of advanced research actually coming from China. But now with DeepSeek, I think they're just showing, hey, we've got the talents. We didn't even need to
Mhm.
source globally. Think about what we can do if we can. I think this is also another statement that they are trying to make with all of this open sourcing, or just open sourcing is another soft influence to the research and development world as well, right? So going back to your original question of and how do I feel? Very proud as a Chinese person that a Chinese company is able to get there. But I'm sure that any advanced nation with good tech talent, I'm sure, countries like India will definitely get there. Hopefully, Europe will have something better in the coming years. Fingers crossed, because I do live in the UK now. So I do want Europe to still be in a really good place. Or maybe that's
Love
the
it.
why
You
you moved
know,
away from Europe because you lost faith. But
appreciate the new caps on the bottles, though. Does the UK do that too, or just the rest of Europe?
yes, it's got into the
Or
UK as well. It is very annoying. In general, I am super excited about where this whole thing is going. I'm sure other Chinese companies will be also releasing more interesting stuff, but in general, what DeepSeek is doing forces the whole industry to move faster and enables them to move faster because of the open source nature of the thing. And that to me is what feels exciting. And in general, having more competition is always good, whether it's between countries, between companies, or between different technical approaches.
since we're talking about the future and predictions, are you buying Nvidia stock now that it's down?
Um, Personally, I wouldn't. My take is the other reason I'm not sure that this was talked about significantly in Twitter or other places is Huawei at the end of last year also announced their Ascent, was it 100C? I can't remember the exact model number, AI chip that they were making, produced purely out of China. And one
Mm,
thing that they purposely built the chip for was inference time compute. So not as efficient for pre-training, but very efficient for inference time usage. And the people were claiming this, not verified, but we're just looking at a lot of sources claiming that DeepSeek R1 and V3 are running on this new infrastructure. So I think the
mm,
hit on Nvidia stock wasn't just because of DeepSeek making things more efficient, making people think that you don't need as many GPUs anymore, but also the fact that China may be able to self-supply a lot of these chips. Additionally, may be able to produce these for a lot cheaper. Think Huawei for 5G tech or China
mm.
for electric vehicles, because they were able to internalize this because they have the supply chain, so they're able to get this out way faster. So maybe Nvidia finally has a new competitor, but there's a number that I know like people wouldn't start worry about yet because look at the reports. They only have apparently 20% yield, which is extremely low for chip making. And apparently you
Mm.
need around 70% to make the chip production actually viable. So they've still got a long way to go. But Huawei still said they were going to scale up production at the beginning of this year. So we'll see how they
Or you're
do.
buying Power stock.
And I'm definitely like supporting Huawei in this, not because it's a Chinese company, but more as it's an interesting competitor that has been handcuffed quite a lot, but purely as interesting future prediction. There's a lot of opportunity there. What about you?
I tend to agree with Karpathy's take, if you've seen it on Twitter, which is the paper basically show that we can't scale via compute. So we're going to need more compute. And,
Mm,
televisions used to be very expensive too, and only a few people bought them. But then as they become cheaper, more people buy stuff. So overall, I'm pretty sure that the market for television is bigger in the end. So I assume that's what's going to happen with chips as well. Just because they're cheaper doesn't mean that not going to make a profit. They're just probably going to sell more of them, and you and I will be training DeepSeek
mm.
in on our desks.
That moment, I'm definitely very excited for. I think my personal take is that that's why Apple stock actually grew during
Mm,
this and during this the whole tech sell-off. If I remember the numbers correctly, Apple stock rose by 4% and then Nvidia fell by 16. Whether Apple planned for this or not is that they were a huge proponent of local deployed LLMs. Even with Apple Intelligence, they were talking a lot about how running most things on your Mac, on your iPhone, and also, only when it's needed, shifting the compute into the cloud, which is still private, according to Apple. So then this plays very well with Apple's way of doing things, where in most cases, I was made a tweet about this a few days ago of I believe the majority of user AI queries will likely be served with locally deployed LLMs in within
mm,
2 years' time. Just because, like you said, you wouldn't use R01, you'd use 4 most of the time because it's efficient, it's fast, it's sufficient, right? And I think this will be the similar case. If the distilled DeepSeek models can get so good that you can literally run a local model on your iPhone, why would you need GPUs in the cloud to run this? But
mm,
that said, it will run most of the consumer payload, but I don't see this thing actually running most of the enterprise payload, even though that won't be the majority of the queries, but it will consume probably 90% or maybe even 95, 99% of the compute. So it's not a question. I guess my statement is not about how we won't need more compute, but more on locally deployed LLMs and local models becomes way more viable. Like you mentioned, fine tuning your own model, maybe just running all code with all context of your file structure, everything, maybe the million token Gemini Flash model type models running locally. That would be amazing. We are able to shove in so much context into your local model without worrying about privacy and such.
Speaking of consumers, how do you think these chat interfaces will create stickiness? Because I am one of the biggest ChatGPT fans. As I said, it's replacing Google for me. I rarely make Google searches. But the moment DeepSeek was released, I'm like, oh, okay, I'll switch to this tab now. And
Mm,
again, I'm one of the stickiest consumers of ChatGPT. How do you think people will produce more attrition? And also, will they? Maybe the chat interface is doomed. Maybe there's just a game that's not worth playing.
mm. I think we can look back at how Web 2 did really well. I mean, the previous big tech, Google gives us the stickiness because of the amount of personalization and data they hold about us. And then so using Google is just so effective. And even today, I would say, if Google came out with a model as good as GPT-4o, I'd instantly switch back.
Mm,
Or with the
mm,
same kind of UX because it already has all of my Google Drive, my Gmail, my calendar, and if it can literally, book me Google payments, everything, right? Book me things end to end. I'd more than happily use Google, but most times it's just Gemini is still not quite that yet, both in terms of UX and capability, at least from a consumer perspective. So I feel like personalization is the key here because ChatGPT kind of started doing this, but I don't feel like they've done enough, which is the memories feature. They try to remember segments about your preference of, oh, say, Raluca asked, because Julia asked a lot about, let's say, machine learning. Therefore, she's always an interested machine learning person. Show more technical details here. Or she asked a lot about maybe how to create YouTube videos. Here's her interest in the future. Here's more context I can give her specific on that. I think that's what was missing from ChatGPT. It felt like they had a start, but never really pushed forward. Similarly for GPTs, the GPT store felt like it was going to be a huge thing. Whether it's because the market didn't need it or whether it's for some other reason, I don't know. But it just didn't have any, like you said, the stick in the personalization. I feel is the main thing that's missing. The level of integration. Nor did ChatGPT try to integrate, say, like Zapier or the equivalent to connect a lot of the services. Boom, straight in your ChatGPT, done, right? And they're still just slowly adding in natively built features. So really, if another company comes up with a good tech, good product, it's so easy for them to get users. And maybe that's why DeepSeek released the app so quickly. Perhaps they didn't even want to, but then decided, oh, actually, people are so interested. Let's do this because it was so
Mm.
easy.
What
What do you think?
about
Yeah.
um I agree with you. I actually use ChatGPT almost like a co-founder. I tell it my business ideas and it's finding the right balance between being yes and but also um not agreeing with me all the time. However, a lot of times I have to repeat the situation that I'm in and the idea that I'm working on. And I don't have a lot of transparency on what it remembers and whatnot, because it clearly remembers things across sessions, but is just not very transparent to me what exactly. So basically I'm
Mm,
craving that sort of personalization that you mentioned, that sort of memory that carries over from query to query. And it's not
yeah.
there yet for sure.
Yeah. And I
What about
definitely feel that you you get so much context just by analyzing the queries. It's just like Google knows so much about you, about your personal behavior or your intent, your desires, your habits, just by looking at the queries, even if they didn't care about the search results. I feel like that is a level of analysis that's required by these companies. And maybe that's why DeepSeek is also collecting our keystrokes, is they want that data mode. Fine. But we'll see what interesting stuff they come out with. Because I also remember for DeepSeek, the CEO actually said they weren't interested in doing consumer apps, but they could very easily if they wanted to, if they saw opportunity. This to me is the exact moment of where they saw opportunity and then shipped something extremely quickly.
what about developers? How do you build loyalty among developers?
Personally speaking, I don't see how you build loyalty amongst developers to your own API servers if you're open source. So this is the thing I still haven't got, unless maybe they do have some kind of in-house optimization that or hardware tuning they never released, and then they're able to just undercut the price by 20%, say, without with while still making the same profit margin. Maybe that's the only way. And then having separately deployed Western models by a different operator, and then a Chinese deployed version separately. Maybe that can also help gain trust. But in general, I don't think they need to do much other than to keep the price low, or I mean, keep building more efficient models and keep things open source. That what about? I mean, like when you are building applications, would you now switch your open API integration straight into changing that to DeepSeek with a new API key now?
There's so much infrastructure that makes that switch extremely easy. If you think of Hugging Face or Light LLM, all of these interfaces completely hide the underlying model. So
Mm,
from that point of view, from the technical difficulty of switching, it's almost zero. It's sometimes just the flag to pass in the right Claude version. So yeah, no, I have no loyalty at the moment.
mm. Then if we go a bit further down that rabbit hole, are we saying that frontier models actually have a harder time compared to applications to get
Absolutely.
sticky users because of, like you mentioned, that infrastructure, that no, I mean, it's just that infrastructure, and it's so easy to make the switch. And unless they built in some kind of underneath the hood optimizations. At the end of the day, it's just cost and capability. It's just price to performance ratio, right? We don't really care about the O3 that's got the 90% on the ARC AGI with, was it $30,000? Oh, $300,000. Something on
Mhm.
that order of magnitude. But people care about, oh, I can do this for 10 cents. Yes.
To me, the strongest proof that foundational LLMs are commoditized is how well the comparison with food matches LLMs. So think about it. Food is also super critical. Like you need food to survive. The same way LLMs will probably be critical for technology because everything will run on them. However, a lot of people are making very, very small margins out of food. So just because they're addressing a very core necessity, it doesn't mean that they're going to be sticky or they're going to be very profitable. That's exactly the same with, agriculture and food. So because the comparison is so eerie, it, to me is the ultimate proof that it is a commoditized industry.
Yeah. Do you think we'll have a very similar war to how cloud happened a decade ago, where AWS was the first, and then it's still the top, right? And but when other providers actually came along with in similar tech and similar price, they were able to grab a lot of the customers that way. Do you think this case is similar?
I think that's a complicated question. If you think about agriculture, it didn't happen that way. There's still a lot of small players. Yeah, if you think about cloud, it kind of converged to four big ones. I honestly don't know. I can see
Mm,
both futures happening where, as I said before, you and I are training our models on our desks and then we're selling them on some low margin marketplace. But I also see a future where 3 years in, LLM training stops being so sexy. They stop attracting so much good talent, and then only four companies will survive. That's a possibility too.
yeah, I just hope at least it's four companies. It's not one. As long as it's not one, I'm definitely happier. And also, it's four companies, ideally distributed by four different nations. That would be the best possible case.
Yeah, I agree. What are your criticisms of DeepSeek? What are things that you didn't like? What did they botch about this launch?
I I'm not sure if they aim for this to be a consumer launch because everything felt like, oh, they saw a moment and then just decided to go with it, go with the flow, with everything they did, because they did similar kind of really soft releases of new things every other few months, and then just 2 days ago, I'm not sure if you saw, they released their image generation models that apparently is on par with DAO E3. Didn't even make a tweet about it. It was just released directly on GitHub with a paper. I was like, okay, is that do AI companies just give us stuff for free now? Is that the new norm? If so, I'm happy. But it's they've always been the type of company that's really embodying the build it, they will come type mentality, which
Western
I
style.
it's yeah, it's I don't feel like that works too well in this world. Is it's good at it's in your favor to create more market hype. I do want Leon to be more out there, to be, like chanting more about DeepSeek. I think that would be amazing. And for us to learn a bit more about the team, the company behind it, to see more interesting launches, and then to see them getting into more interesting consumer side of things. But really, this is asking for the cherry on top of the cake now. And I'm just bitching about not having a tasting of cherry on top. It's despite having an amazingly tasting Black Forest Gato, right?
I
What
was
about you
watching
though?
the I was watching the CNBC mini documentary they made about DeepSeek. Really good. But they couldn't reach anyone from the company to interview. And that was surprising to me. Why would they not want to ride the wave? Why would they not want to be famous? I mean, open sourcing something means you want to be
Exactly.
out there.
Mm. In a way, uh, maybe this deeply rooted in the company. I was doing the similar research. I saw the CEO only ever did two public talks ever since
Mhm.
the past, well, now 10 years since the company's inception, or at least the quant trading firm's inception. So maybe that's just part of the company culture to just build and then let developers believe in what we have. In a way, I think that may have worked quite well. That may have worked quite well for them because now people are like flocking toward DeepSeek to go, oh, yeah, you feel more trust when they don't give you so much marketing spiel. And I know people
Mhm.
dug up Sam Altman's interview from, was it 2023, saying, yeah, don't compete with us. I mean, I may have botched the original wording, but it's basically, don't compete with us, you won't win. Well,
Yeah, he does that when I was in YC, I did summer 24 and he came to our batch and I heard that speech yet again. Just don't try to compete with us, ride our wave. And I'm like, isn't that convenient to tell a huge room of ambitious people to not compete with you?
so
Would you
yeah,
have said that if you were still the partner or the CEO, whatever, of YC? I don't know.
I think we talked about the launches as if it was a bad thing, but I mean, given the users they have, the attention they have, whatever the launch was, however botched they thought it was, or the world thinks it was amazing. It worked. Right. Any criticisms on your part?
My criticisms are in the same vein. The main one is the paper is not structured very well. It's very hard to read. But again, they made all of this information public and it's amazing technological innovation. So I'm just also asking for the cherry on top. So it wasn't super straightforward to follow. The second complaint, but it's a feature request more than a complaint is the fact that they didn't open source their training data or they don't have a lot of clarity in the paper as well on how they produce the training data. And I think there's a little bit of controversy around them using ChatGPT and not admitting it in the paper. At least from the CNBC interview that I watched, at some point the model was claiming to be ChatGPT and made by OpenAI. I don't know exactly if that was through the web interface and they fixed it in the meantime. Anyway, there were claims like that, which means maybe the paper isn't 100% truthful, and also maybe that's why they didn't release the training set. But I'm happy to see that Hugging Face has an effort is calling contributors to try to reproduce the entire thing end to end.
Yeah. I mean, naturally, as a Chinese person, normally I would want to say, yeah, yeah, I want 100% defend it. No, 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 they didn't copy anything. But if we look at history, there's definitely incidents of similar things that's happening. And in a lot of ways, I think this is only the smart way to compete. Not saying it's the right way to compete, but it's a smart way to compete for most countries. And even I think looking back at history, US only introduced their IP laws after a lot of espionage of getting European tech back in, was it the 18th or 19th century? I can't remember the exact timing. So you protect yourself when you are ahead. When you're behind, why follow the rules?
Yeah, exactly.
And
It
yeah,
did.
so the setting the moral standard here, I think, will be very difficult because the top players will want to protect themselves, and then the people who are catching up will do whatever they can to do it. And again, just never saying this is the right way to do it, but I can definitely see why they're doing it.
Yeah. Do you know if it's against OpenAI's terms and conditions to train on that data generated by them?
Must be, right? We should just check
If
now.
I were OpenAI, I would
I would
explicitly.
add this in today. Just go, hey, because I think they can, right? Let's see. Is it does OpenAI allow training on their models?
Are you asking ChatGPT?
Yep. DeepSeek needs to build a desktop app. I'd switch over very quickly.
Mhm.
I think even if I paid for every single query by credits, it would still be cheaper than the $20 per month. More likely. Okay, there we go. Answer. OpenAI's terms of service explicitly prohibits using their service to develop models that compete with their own product. So yes,
What does it mean to compete? If you're open source, are you competing with OpenAI?
very good point. This is probably another part of the smart play, right? Because in a lot of ways, you can hate a company for stealing things for their own use, but you can't hate a company that's like Robin Hood, that's stealing
Right,
from the rich and giving it to everyone for free. So
right.
thinking on that point,
Question. What's the impact for startups in particular? And I mean very early startups. Does it impact them at all?
I'd say quite a lot because of the cost efficiency. Because previously, the well, I mean, because DeepSeek reduced the cost by a nearly or more than an order of magnitude for the exact same capability. This should enable, say, a lot of startups who might not have funding to be able to maybe even bootstrap and then test and build things just in house. For the startup that already has funding, they can do either provide better user experience for the same price or just massively reduce their cost base in a lot of ways, or maybe even make, replacing some of the previous manual labor that felt too pricey and then making that completely viable given the low cost. So I think cost is the major playing factor here. And then that should hugely benefit a lot of startups. I think we'll probably see even more of an explosion of consumer startups building on top of this. Now that people can see, oh, the foundational models is way more competitive, even more competitive, or building infrastructure there is even more competitive. You should just, like we said, build consumer tech, build applications that actually has a user mode, dominate your niche and expand from there. I know that's the YC mantra, right?
Yeah. I also agree that DeepSeek is a good reminder of how important the surface or your UX is. Again, if the infrastructure layer is getting so commoditized, all that matters is that you have a distribution channel or you have a UX that is sticky and people will not just leave when the next shiny thing comes out because there's some intrinsic value in the networks effect, in the community that you've built, or in the quality of content that you produce. So it's just a reminder that GPT wrapper, quote unquote, is less of a joke than it ever was.
Yeah, funny that, right? A year ago, everyone's saying, yeah, GPT wrappers will all die when OpenAI gets so good. Turns out to be the complete opposite.
Yeah, OpenAI is kind of limping a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, and the really funny comment I saw is ChatGPT lost its job to AI.
Yes, I
And
actually retweeted that tweet. I thought it was incredibly funny.
but in general, we love seeing competition. It's such an exciting space to watch right now. What are your predictions for the coming year
Hmm.
based on what we're discussing, like purely on the model and application front? Yeah.
I like to think that OpenAI is cooking something. There's a lot of rumors about GPT-5 and how it's meaningfully better than O1. I don't even have enough imagination to figure out in what ways it could be better other than just like cheaper and faster O1. But I'm always excited to hear what they come up with because it just beats my imagination. The whole idea of reasoning models um, was pretty innovative, I think, in 2024 when OpenAI came with it. And yeah, I don't use O1 on a regular basis, but I don't know if consumers are going to still keep benefiting from these LLMs getting better and better. I feel like for consumers, we've already reached a peak at which we don't appreciate any more improvements beyond what we're seeing. So it's probably
Hmm.
going to move higher up the chain to companies and enterprises will actually benefit more and more from these incredible compute powers.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It feels like now 2025 should be the year of AI applications, given so many frontier models are being so it's just commoditized right now. When you're at the cost of DeepSeek V3 and R1, there's almost no reason to not build in some kind of UX improvements leveraging AI, whether it's leveraging AI to build or building AI natively into your own application. Um,
Mhm.
and because of that challenge for foundational models to gain that stickiness, people doing foundational models, I'm sure they will venture further into the consumer space. ChatGPT's operator, I think, is a great example of, hey, here's the thing that we build on top. I can see people, if they found operator to be reliable and effective, they'll stick with ChatGPT even if a new model comes out. But I'm sure there will be open source alternatives that try to glue everything together to create operator, perhaps from DeepSeek, combined with I think saw a recent project called Browser Use, also a recent YC company, looks quite
Mhm.
exciting. Open source like computer use equivalent, just compose everything to create very similar things. But in general, yeah, consumer, I'm super excited for consumer application development. Super exciting session. And I can't believe that was an hour that would gone by so quickly. And we should do this more often. This has been quite
Yeah,
fun.
it was fun chatting. It was really fun chatting.